to talk a bit about how to build a longitudinal cohort, but I just wanted to frame it in the context of the talk that we just heard, which is why cohorts are so important to understanding life course conditions. And I think that those of us who know kind of the foundational science understand that, of course, we can often get the most strongest evidence for causal relationships if we can do a randomized trial. But we also know that trials are expensive, they're complex, they're difficult to maintain. And I would say one of the larger limitations in the context of life course health is that really trials allow us to examine maybe one or a couple of exposures at a fixed dose at a set time period. And when we reflect on the context that we just heard in Roz's talk, that exposures can interact, they can co-occur, they may have different windows of susceptibility, we really need to look to cohort as the foundational substrate for the importance of research into life course origins of health. So this is why a cohort like Project Viva was set up, and I'll give full credit to Matthew Gilman, who is my predecessor in sort of coming up with the idea and establishing a cohort like Project Viva, which has now been going on for 20 years, amazingly. So Matt and colleagues enrolled women who are receiving prenatal care at a multi-specialty group practice in the greater Boston area in Massachusetts, all of whom were pregnant with singleton infants, and there were over 2,100 births into the cohort from 1990 to 2003. So 20 years later, we have a cohort that continues to include over 1,500 mother-child pairs who remain enrolled, which is a tremendous accomplishment, mostly, I would say, on the part of a terrific research staff who do the groundwork of motivating participants, contacting them, finding them when we lose them, digging through all kinds of resources creatively online, tracing friends and family contacts that they gave us. And so I would say the most important part of a cohort study is a fantastic, dedicated, and motivated staff. And we are fortunate to get people who come in already terrific, but I think that one of the things that we really try to do is help them understand the science behind why something like retention is so important, and how if we don't have strong retention of the cohort, we first of all lose the opportunity to study later outcomes. We lose power to study more rare outcomes or exposures, and we can experience bias in the cohort because we may have differential follow-up. And then I'd just like to give a special credit to one of our staff members, Alex Shostak, who helped with the presentation, which also goes to show you that having a strong, steady staff is helpful in many ways. So this is a kind of high-level representation of the kinds of data that we've collected longitudinally in the cohort. Each of these lines going horizontally reflects one study participant. And so you can see that we recruited on the time axis along the bottom between 1999 and 2002. And then as we follow participants along, we've collected data from different kinds of visits. So, starting at enrollment, we have the dates of birth that are in the green dots, and those we collected by way of medical records. We have had in-person visits with moms and kids. In fact, not represented here is the in-person visits that we did with moms in the clinics at the end of the first trimester at enrollment, and then again in the late second trimester when we collected questionnaire measures, interview measures, and also were able to piggyback on the clinical blood draw to collect additional blood samples for research data collection. So then we saw many of the moms and infants in the hospital at the time of birth. So we were able to collect some measurements that are not really easily obtained from medical records. So for example, infant length, which is very difficult to measure accurately, infant blood pressure, and some additional questionnaire measures about late pregnancy. And then other in-person measures have really tracked with the different developmental life stages. But as you can see, these blue dots sort of line up very nicely longitudinally at birth and then start to spread out with subsequent visits in infancy, early childhood, middle childhood, and adolescence. We're currently conducting our 7th in-person visit, I think, which is at mid to late adolescence as the kids are about 17 to 18 years old. And then in the interim, we collect annual questionnaires, which originally were mailed and now increasingly are online digital questionnaires. And then in addition, we collect biosamples at all of our in-person visits reflected by the red dots. So I sort of like this high level picture because it really gives you a sense of just how much data is involved longitudinally in following a cohort of this size. So the focus of the cohort from the beginning has been the conditions that are the major health problems that affect children. So initially it was really around pregnancy complications and birth outcomes. And as we followed the kids over time, the main streams of outcomes have included growth, cardiovascular disease risk factors. So we have collected these in a variety of developmentally appropriate ways, starting in infancy with just weight and length measurements, and again, highlighting the importance of research measures, blood pressure. Over time, as the kids got older and more tolerant of blood sticks and fasting blood collections, we've been collecting fasting blood. In addition to the anthropometric measures, which we collected in younger children, as children reached middle childhood and were more able to hold still, as you can see represented in the bottom bubble, we started collecting Dexa measurements on the children, which give us information about body composition as well as overall size. A second stream of outcomes, which Roz mentioned is a major stream that's important for child health, includes asthma and atopy. And again, early in life, we really focus on questionnaire measures. As the kids have gotten older and can participate in more sophisticated measures, we collect breathing measures, including spirometry before and after albuterol inhaler, and multiple measures of allergy, including blood levels of IgE and questionnaire measures and measures of food allergy. And then the last stream is really focused on neurocognitive development. So all the way back into infancy, we have measures of visual recognition memory. And then as the kids develop, we look at everything from IQ to behavioral measures to measures of autism diagnosis, but also autism-related traits such as social cognition. In addition to these outcomes, we really have a pretty expansive view of the kinds of environmental exposures that these children are exposed to. So we think about everything from diet, traffic-related pollution, weather, infant diet, maternal socio-demographic factors, toxic exposures like smoking, and also environmental exposures that are not toxic, like exposure to nature and trees. And again, one of the real reasons that we think cohorts are such a rich source of foundational knowledge in studying life course origins of chronic health conditions is that in one analysis, we can look at something like cigarette smoking as an exposure. In another analysis, we might look at it as a covariate or maybe a confounder or possibly even a mediator if we're thinking maybe of stress causing smoking, resulting in outcome. And then we can also look at these as we sort of move to a more whole exposome-related approach, think about multiple exposures in combination. And so this is really the tremendous richness of a cohort study, but of course it adds lots of complexity. And so in order to get all these different kinds of data, we really need to be creative and broad in our collection of data from a variety of sources. So at in-person visits, we collect all kinds of research measures, and we constantly appreciate the tension between, trying to collect everything that we possibly can and not overwhelming our participants. So of course, they get a little more tolerant over time, but we currently are conducting with our older adolescents about a 3.5-hour visits with both mom and kid. At those in-person visits, we collect all these outcome and covariate data that I mentioned by a combination of research measures, also interviews and questionnaires, and then the questionnaires can be fortunately now conducted online as well as in person. We get consent for medical record, and it's a large project to abstract medical records over time. We've also increasingly been using monitors like actigraphs or Fitbits to monitor things like physical activity and sleep. We have address data on all of our participants from every time point since enrollment, and so we can look at the kinds of geocode-linked data that Roz was discussing, things like particulate pollution, nature exposure, traffic exposure, things like that. And of course, all the variety of biospecimens that we collect, which include not only blood, but also hair, urine, dust from the child's bedroom, And so we've gotten quite creative with all the kinds of things that we can do with this breadth of data sources.